All right, welcome back, the genius. So in this section, let's talk about function scope. All right. I know we have actually mentioned scope in another section, but let's really take a look at what we mean by function scope this time around. And although we'll still maybe have to recap a bit about other scopes of function, other types of scope in JavaScript. But we'll take a look at what we mean by function scope and let us explain more, okay, with more examples, okay? So in JavaScript, understanding function scope is fundamental, especially when working with variables and functions across different contexts, okay? So when you really understand scope, all right, you know where and where you can access your variables. What are the boundaries, okay? From where to where can you access your variable. So when you do this, you get to understand better. It will be easier for you. Okay. So JavaScript primarily has three types of scopes: the global, the local or function scope, and the block scope. All right. So the global scope, variables declared outside any function are in the global scope. Whenever you declare any function, okay, outside a function, it is a global scope. All right. They can be accessed and modified from any part of the code. So any code, any variable you define outside a function is a global scope. They can be accessed and modified from any part of the code. Okay. And in the browser environment, globally scoped variables and functions are added to the window object. While in Node.js, they are part of the global object. But I will need to explain this. Okay. When you use var to create your variables, this tends to be true. But when you use let or constant keyword to create your variables, this is not true. And basically, that is even why ESCs is better, and the let keyword and the constant keyword is what you should be using to create your variables. Because when you have global variables like this, they can actually cause errors or make your code can it's short, it's not really cool, all right, having variables in the global object, okay? So let me show you what we mean. They said in the browser object, globally scoped variables and functions are added to the window object. So if I go to the browser now, if I go to the browser, okay, and let me just go to the console. They said globally scope when you create a variable, all right, outside a function, it is included in the global in the window object. So if I do this, if I say var first name is equal to person, okay, if I do this and if I run the window object, if I check the window object, I say window dot first name, you can see that I have it here. It is global and it is added in the window object. In the browser environment, when you create a variable, a global variable, it is added in the window or in the window object. But let's also look at this. If I say let last name equal to Mohan, all right? And if I try to access the window dot last name, you will see that we can't find it. It's not available. It is undefined. Why? Because I am using let here to create this variable. So when you use let or constant keyword to create variables, they are not added to the window. In the browser context, they are not added to the window object. I think this was intentional, all right? Because you can see this one now using var added it to the window object. So it is advisable to avoid this, always use let and constant keyword to create your variables. Var can actually be a huge problem. Don't use var anymore, all right? Always use let. So if I also go to node, if I open in terminal, if I open node, the same thing works here. If I say var last name is equal to John, okay? If I say global, because it will be added to the global object. If I say global dot last name, you can see we have it here, all right? We have it here. But if I use let surname equal to this, okay? And if I try to access the global object, if I say global dot surname, I do not have it. It is not available. So if I run it, it's undefined. So if you use var to create global variables, it will be added to the, depending on the environment. If it is a browser environment, it will be added to the window. If it's Node.js environment, it will be added to the global. But if you use let keyword to create your variable, it will not be added to any of these. And it is better, all right? It is way, way, way better, okay? So now when you say let global equals to this will not be available in the global scope. But the thing is that your function cannot access global objects. So let's go to writing real code. Okay, so I think I will just have to create a file called scope. All right. So if I create a variable here called, this is surname. If I create surname equals to do, all right? And I have a function. I have a function say hi, and I want to say console.log. I will say hello last name, hello surname. All right. If I do this, I can access from this function, I can access a global variable. All right, because this surname is a global variable which is inside the global scope. It is accessible from anywhere. So inside the function, I can also access it. So if I call this would actually work. All right, because this surname is it's in a global scope, it's a global variable, and the function can actually access it. Of course, if I run it, we'll get the desired output. Okay, we'll get the desired output. All right, so it is accessible. Global scope are accessible from the function. Okay, so we also have the local or the function scope. The local or the function scope, any variable that is inside the function. So the scope of a function starts from the declaration of the function, okay? Inside the declaration of the function. So variables declared inside a function using var, let, or constant are the function's local scope. These variables cannot be accessed from outside the function. They are local to that function. You cannot access them outside the function. They are local to the function, okay? So JavaScript functions create a new scope every time they are called. Whenever you create a JavaScript, it creates, whenever you call a JavaScript function, it creates a new scope, which means that variables within a function do not interfere with variables in other functions of global scope. Now, look at this example. This variable here is local, all right? So it can be accessible from here, but we have this local variable inside of this function. If you try to access it outside of the function, it will not be accessible. So if I go back to code, if I go back to code and I have a variable, let local variable equal to 90. So if I try to access this local variable from here, it will not be available because it is a function scope variable. It is a local variable. All right. If I try to access it, there'll be an error because I'm trying to access something that is not available. Okay. Yeah, it has thrown an error. It has thrown a reference error because this local variable is not accessible outside of this scope. This is where the scope starts from. All right. From the first curly brace and it ends at the second curly brace. Okay. So everything inside here is the scope. So the scope, the boundary of all the of the variables inside of a function starts from here and ends here. Okay. Now we also have the block scope. Now, which it was introduced in ES6. So whenever you use the let and the constant keyword to create variables, you're creating a block scope. That is why we couldn't have those variables we created with let. We couldn't have it in the global window, in the window object or in the global object because they are not global scoped objects. So if you create variables with let or constant, all right, they are not global scope, they are block scope. So it will not be added to the global window or to the global object or to the window object. So when you create variables with let and constant keyword, you're creating a block scope. So block scope is created when you use the let or constant keyword within a query, open and any query braces like this. Inside if statements, inside loops, inside functions, they are all block scope. Now, unlike the var keyword, which ignores block scope and is only function scoped. So let and constant keyword restrict access to the block in which they are defined. Now, to explain this, let's go back to code. Okay, if I create this function with var, okay, of course, we still wouldn't access it because it is outside, all right? But what we are saying here is this. If I have something like this and then I say, if um, if true, all right? I'm creating a new scope. If true, I will say uh, let's age let age equal to 90 and var salary equal to 90,000 or whatever. Okay. Now, look at what I'm trying to do here. I have created, this is a block scope. This is a block scope. Now, the thing is this. I created two variables using let and a var. Now, when you create a variable with let keyword, it is a block scoped. It cannot be accessed outside this block. But for the var, if you create with the var keyword, it is function scope, not local, not block scope. So you see the salary, I can access it outside of this block scope. Normally, it's supposed to give an error. So if I say console.log and I say I'm accessing, let me access salary first. All right. Then I want to access console.log. I want to access the age. All right, the second one will throw an error because we cannot access it. So if I call this function now, okay, now this will be accessible. The salary is accessible outside, but the age cannot be accessible outside. Why? Because with the let keyword, you're creating a block scope, but with the var keyword, this var keyword, wherever you create it, is going to be function scope. Remember, function scope will be accessible anywhere within the function. but block scope will only be accessible on anywhere within the block. So this is a block scope, all right? And here is the function scope. So you can see that our salary was accessible outside the block scope, but our age wasn't accessible because it was created with the age keyword. So always avoid using var keyword, because here I can also access, if I run this now, there will be no issues with the salary, but there will be issues with the age. So always avoid using var. Imagine that we have another, um, salary here. We have another variable called salary here. Which one are we now working? We can see now this guy now is giving us errors because we have here and here. So this one is being this salary here is also seen as a function scope variable, and you're also having it here. But if I change this thing now to let, there will be no issues. Do you understand it? Okay, because this let is block scope, but the var was an issue. The var is function scope. So be very careful. Sure, if you want to avoid, even if you don't understand what I'm explaining here, just avoid it. Avoid using var keyword to create variables, please. Stop using var keyword. Use let or constant. Okay. All right. So this is what we have already seen. I think I have explained it already. All right. Avoid using var keyword in order to. So we also have what we call the lexical scope and closures. But the thing is that we will not be discussing closures. We'll be discussing closures in an advanced chapter, okay? When we talk about functions, that's what we discuss closure. But basically, lexical scope means that functions are executed using the scope in which they are defined. So lexical scope of a function is the scope of the function in which it is defined. All right, not the scope in which they are invoked. Invoke is the execution. All right, so let me show you something. Lexical scope means functions are executed using the scope in which they are defined. Scope in which they are defined and scope in which they are invoked are two different things. So let me show you right now. All right, this is the function. This is the scope in which this function is defined. So this could be the lexical scope, but the function is executed here. So everything like this is the execution, the scope in which it is invoked. All right, but the scope in which it is defined is just this. All right, so it is just this. But here we are executing it, so it is everything inside it. But even if we have, let's say we are calling another, we have this function, or okay, if I say, because I can actually call this same function here, all right? So this function now, all right? This function, say here, this is the lexical scope. But this function here, this is being executed inside of this scope. So the execution scope is also inside here because it's been executed inside here. But what this one, the execution scope is outside of the function scope. So the execution scope for this particular execution of this function is everything here, is this whole file, but the execution scope for this one is here. Why the lexical scope is where it is being defined, okay? All right. If you don't understand it, no problem. We'll explain more when we start talking about closures, okay? Now, this allows inner functions to access variables in outer functions, which can lead to closures. I will not want to talk too much about closures here. We will talk about closures in a separate session, okay? But it's an advanced one. So a closure occurs when an inner function remembers the variables from its outer function, because a function can have another function inside it. So, but we'll discuss that in details when we talk about closures, okay? So lexical scope. So look at what I mean. You can see this outer function here. All right, the scope is this first one, this first curly brace and ends here. But this other inner function, the scope is from this curly brace to this other curly brace. So this is an inner function. But now there is a closure here. There is a lexical scope. From here to here is the lexical scope. All right. So this function now this function, this inner function, its lexical scope is from here, this first one to this one. That is the lexical scope. All right. So anything inside of its lexical scope, this inner function can have access to it. Don't worry, we'll explain this thing more when we talk about closures. Okay. So if you don't understand it, don't worry. I wouldn't want to bother you with it. This is more, it is advanced. Okay. So now var versus let versus constant in function scope. var declarations are function scoped, meaning they are accessible throughout the entire function, which even if they are declared within a block, all right, I have told you, avoid it because the declarations are function scoped. Let and constant declaration are block scoped. Always use let and constant declaration. So they are only accessible within the block they are defined in. Okay, they're only accessible within the block they are defined in. Variables are hoisted. var variables are hoisted to the top of the function scope, meaning they are moved to the top in memory, but initialized as undefined until assigned. We have also talked about this in previous section, but let and constant are hoisted as well, but remain uninitialized. They are also hoisted, but they remain uninitialized. While var variables are hoisted and they are also initialized as undefined. So these guys are let and constant are hoisted as well, but uninitialized in a temporal dead zone until they are actually declared. So always avoid the var keyword. Okay, always avoid the var keyword. That's just the whole thing. Okay, so what about nested scopes and the scope chain? When a variable is not found in the current scope, JavaScript looks up the scope chain to the next outer scope, continuing until it either finds the variable or reaches the global scope. So what it means is this. Let me show you what we mean by nested scope. This is a scope here, and there's a nested scope here. All right. So if I say, okay, let me assume I have another. Okay, the thing is this. Let me say console.log, and I want to console surname. What happens is this. We have a nested scope. We have a block scope here, which is inside a function scope, which is inside the global scope. All right. Now, we are trying to access surname as a variable here. So what JavaScript will do is this. JavaScript will first of all look for this surname within the nearest scope, within this scope. If it finds it, fine, no problem. All right, it will use it. But if it doesn't find it, it will go up to the next scope, which will be this one. If it doesn't find it, if it finds it, fine, it will use it. But if it doesn't find it, it will go over to the next scope, which is the global scope. Do you understand it? So this is what we call nested scope, all right? Or when we talk about chaining of scope. So JavaScript we look for variables in its nearest scope, all right? If it doesn't see it, if it sees it, it will use it. If it doesn't see it, it will go up to the next scope. If it doesn't see it, it will go up to the global scope. And if it doesn't see it in the global scope, it will throw reference error. Okay, it will throw reference error. So that is what we mean here. So if it doesn't find a variable in the global scope, then it will not throw a reference error. So it will check the variable in its enclosing scope. If it doesn't see it there, it will go to the next scope, to the next scope, to the outer scope, to the outer scope until it finds it all. It will throw an error. Okay. So look at what we have here. I have already shown you the example here. Okay. So when you are calling outer variable, you are calling outer variable instead of this inner function. And this outer variable is not defined or declared inside this inner function. So what will happen? It will go outside of this scope, the inner function scope, and to the outer function scope. Now, the outer function scope here, we have outer var. All right, so it would use it. It will not need to go to the global scope again because it was found in the outer function scope. Okay. So, but now if you try to access inner var, the inner var variable is not in the global scope. It is in this inner function scope. So it cannot be accessible outside. So it will throw an error. Okay. So in summary, JavaScript functions can be summarized with these main points. Global scope variables are accessible everywhere. Local or function scope variables confined to the function in which they are defined. So they're only accessible within the function scope, the function in which they are defined. Block scope, they are confined inside a block. A block is just the two curly braces, the opening and the closing curly braces. Lexical scoping and closure. Functions retain access to scope in which they are defined. So we'll talk about this more when we talk about closures. Okay. var variables are hoisted, while let and constant variables are not hoisted. They are block scoped. Okay. Thank you very much. If you don't understand anything, please reach out to us. Okay. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next session.